Hey, brothers and sisters. So I was doing some thinking this morning about the persecution of Israel. One of the things that had popped in my mind is the scripture verse in Luke 21. I wanted to read some of these passages because as I was studying, I assumed that these were parallel passages, but what we need to do in scripture is always rightly divide and consider the immediate context. So Luke 21:19 through 24 says, "By your patience possess your souls. But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation is near. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let those who are in the midst of her depart, and let not those who are in the country enter her. For these are the days of vengeance, that all things which are written may be fulfilled. But woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing babies in those days. For there will be great distress in the land and wrath upon this people. And they will fall by the edge of the sword and be led away captive into all nations. And Jerusalem will be trampled by Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled." Now that verse, that particular verse, got me thinking about what's going to happen in Revelation 12 when the Antichrist pursues the Jews, and I thought that this was a parallel passage, but I'm going to show you why I don't think that anymore. But let's go ahead and read Revelation 12:13 through 17. "Now when the dragon saw that he had been cast to the earth at the midpoint of the tribulation, he persecuted the woman who gave birth to the male child. But the woman was given 2 wings of a great eagle, that she might fly into the wilderness to her place, where she is nourished for a time and times and a half a time, 3.5 years, from the presence of the serpent. So the serpent spewed water out of its mouth like a flood after the woman, that he might cause her to be carried away by the flood. But the earth helped the woman, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed up the flood which the dragon had spewed out of his mouth. And the dragon was enraged with the woman, and he went to make war with the rest of her offspring, who keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus Christ." Okay, so this passage is speaking about the last 3.5 years, when the abomination of desolation talked about in Matthew 24 happens. Jesus said they are told when they see that sign to flee. Why? Because the Antichrist will pursue the Jews, and they are to get out of there, to flee. And obviously they are supernaturally helped. They are supernaturally nourished for 3.5 years. So let's go to Matthew 24 and read that passage. "Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, whoever reads, let him understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let him who is on the housetop not go down to take anything out of his house. And let him who is in the field not go back to get his clothes. But woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing babies in those days. And pray that your flight might not be in winter or on the Sabbath, for then there will be great tribulation, such as not been since the beginning of the world until this time, no, nor ever shall be. And unless those days were shortened, no flesh would be saved, but for the elect's sake, those days will be shortened." Okay, now, how do we make sense of all of these scripture passages? Do they correlate? Obviously, they have a lot of similarities. I'm going to refer to a chart that I found online that I think will be really helpful. But before I go to that chart, I just want to read some comments that I thought were very fitting regarding the context of these immediate passages, just to kind of give you guys a better understanding of what is happening here. So we know that a lot of preterists believe that 70 AD was the fulfillment of Bible prophecy, and there's no future prophecies that have to be fulfilled. But we know that's not true. We know that a lot of the prophecies talking about, especially Matthew 24, are future. But is Luke chapter 21 also future? I think so. I think that it's obviously a fulfillment of 70 AD, but it also speaks of the future time in Zechariah chapter 14, when the nations will battle against Jerusalem. It says in Zechariah 14, starting in verse 1, "Behold, the day of the Lord is coming, and your spoil will be divided in your midst. For I will gather all the nations to battle against Jerusalem. The city shall be taken, the houses rifled, and the women ravished. Half of the city shall go into captivity, but the remnant of the people shall not be cut off from the city. Then the Lord will go forth and fight against those nations as he fights in the day of battle." So I like what Stephen Cole has to say on Luke 21. He says the first part of this discourse focuses on the impending judgment of Jerusalem because of rejecting her Messiah. But the terrible events that happened in 70 AD were just a portent of the events that will lead up to the second coming of Christ in the final judgment. Many of the events that Christ predicted have double or multiple fulfillments, culminating in the grand finale of his return. So there are quite a few similarities between Luke 21 and Matthew 24, but are they referring to the same things? I think it's Scripture giving us specific details about different events. So let's go to that chart and let's try to clear up some of the confusion. So here's a really helpful chart that I discovered while studying these passages of Scripture. This particular chart discusses the differences between Luke 21 and Matthew 24. Let's go through some of these, if not all of these. As we just read the Scripture passages in Luke 21 and Matthew 24, let's look at some of the similarities and some of the differences. So in Luke chapter 21, you can see that the immediate context is in verse 19, which says, "By your endurance you will gain your lives." And notice there's no statement here about preaching the gospel or the end. The focus here is on one's life. But in Matthew 24, the immediate context is verse 14, which says, "And this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in the whole world for a witness to all the nations, and then the end shall come." So the context focuses on the end. Luke 21 says, "But when," but Matthew 24 says, "Therefore when." Luke 21, what they are to see, relates to the city of Jerusalem, which happened in AD 70. Whereas in Matthew 24, verse 15, what they are to see relates to the temple, the future tribulation temple, and the holy place, which takes place at the midpoint of the tribulation period. So who they're addressing in Luke 21 is you. Jesus is addressing the question of the disciples, what specific sign will happen when the temple is destroyed? Whereas in Matthew 24, it addresses you and the reader. Jesus is speaking not only to the disciples, but to all who would read this prophecy in the future. Now here is a big glaring difference, obviously highlighted in green. The sign in Luke 21 is Jerusalem will be surrounded by armies, which will result in her desolation. Whereas in Matthew 24, the sign is the abomination of desolation standing in the holy place. Obviously, this is yet future, whereas Luke 21 happened in the past. Now, just as a side note, I do realize in Zechariah 14, which we had just read, talks about the nations coming against Jerusalem. So I do believe that Luke 21 is foreshadowing that specific prophecy in Zechariah chapter 14, but not specifically the prophecy talked about in Matthew 24 regarding the midpoint of the tribulation. Zechariah 14 is talking about what will happen at the end of the tribulation before Jesus comes, whereas Matthew 24 is talking about the abomination of desolation at the midpoint of the tribulation. It's very important to understand the timing of that. So Luke 21 says surrounded. Matthew 24 says standing. There's no specific mention of the abomination of desolation in Luke 21, but there is in Matthew as well as Mark 13, verse 14. In Luke 21, it talks about armies being mentioned, whereas in Matthew, there is no mention of armies because, once again, it happens in the midpoint of the tribulation, not at the end. Her desolation refers to the desolation of the holy city, Jerusalem, but the desolation talked about, which is yet future, in Matthew 24, refers to the desolation of the holy place in the future tribulation temple. There is no mention of a related prophecy in Daniel, whereas in Matthew 24, the related prophecy is in Daniel 9:27 and Daniel 12 verse 11. Luke 21:21 says, "Those in the midst of the city depart; those in the country not to enter the city." And then there is no mention of the city or a city in Matthew 24. Luke 21 says, "The days of vengeance in order that all things may be fulfilled." There's no parallel in Matthew 24. Luke 21, "Woe to those with child and nursing." There's another similarity, "Woe to those with child and nursing." There's no parallel to what is said in Matthew, "Pray your flight may not be in winter or in the Sabbath." Luke 21, "There will be great distress," whereas in Matthew 24, "great tribulation." Notice there's two different Greek words used here. Let's scroll down here. Luke 21 is "upon the land" implies distress is local, whereas Matthew 24 is talking about global distress. Here's where the big difference is in green. The great distress. Distress is not described as unique or unprecedented, but the great tribulation describes it as unique and unprecedented, meaning it has never happened before. Finishing up, "They will fall by the sword, be led captive into all nations." This is talking about the Jewish dispersion. But in Matthew 24, there's no parallel, and we see that Israel has been gathered back into her land as a part of the end times. Luke 21 talks about Jerusalem being trampled underfoot until the times of the Gentiles. Matthew 24 does not mention that. And Matthew 24 says, "Those days shall be cut short," talking about the last 3.5 years of the tribulation so that the elect would be saved. I just wanted to share this very helpful chart to kind of show you the distinctions between the two passages.